seen a whole lot of bad television on the networks.
Have you?
People using this stuff to, I mean, they don't even help them light, apparently. I mean, there's just some god awful video showing up on network feeds.
Oh yeah, yeah. With people like with people staring right up next to the camera.
Yeah, and you know, black faces and then faces that are blown away. And I see your books back there. Somebody on Twitter really tickled me. He said, if I see you on a network feed in front of your bookcases and I don't see one of my books, you're dead to me.
Well, I'm one of those people who looks, my wife can't believe it because I'll look at, I'm like, okay, there's Caro's book, there's this book. All right, this person, that's how I shop for a house. You know, we would go looking for a house. My wife understood things like plumbing, and I would just look at the people's libraries. You know?
I see.
So probably a good thing she was along. So anyway, well, this is David Cross with Indispensable Leadership, and I am here with Thomas Lewis, who is the author of this book, which was, when did you write this book? Tom, was about
95, I think it came out in 94.
1995. So
like a quarter century ago.
This is an amazing book about the George Washington many people never know. And let me start just by the title, which jumped out at me, For King and Country, The Maturing of George Washington. But then under it is interesting, how greatness eluded an ordinary young man of modest gifts and uncommon ambition. Now, what most people, if you ask someone on the street about George Washington, they'll say he had no ambition and incredible gifts. So right from the start on the title, you're flipping that around. So if you could talk a little bit about how you chose that title and what it means.
What I was trying to get at is that we have an attitude, we cultivate among ourselves an attitude that saints and heroes are born that way. This lets us off the hook because we obviously weren't born that way, so we have no responsibilities when we come to a time that requires leaders and saints and heroes. Let that be taken care of by the people who were born to lead. And I wanted to debunk that, and I saw in Washington a lot of grounds to debunk that. He was not born great. He was not born with advantages. He wasn't born all that smart. And to say that and to attempt to show that is not at all to bring the man down, but rather to enlarge the worth of what he later was able to do with himself, because he was dealing with as flawed and unremarkable a person as you and I are. And yet he turned that flawed and unremarkable person into an incredible figure. I mean, I also later edited a book on the crossing of the Delaware, and the George Washington you meet there is nothing like the bumbling young man of the French and Indian War, nothing at all. And he's changed because he changed himself. He's changed because he rose to the occasion. And that is so different than the notion that, oh, well, he was born that way and he could never tell a lie, and the bullshit about the cherry tree and whatnot is much more comfortable and distancing for us to believe. I keep thinking of it, it's like the lives of the saints, although I never read the lives of the saints. I assume that they're saintly from birth, you know, and one can tell when they're 3 years old that they're going to be a saint. Well, that's a bunch of crap as far as I'm concerned. And I'm far more interested in how people, ordinary people, rise to meet occasions, and others, of course, don't.
And I agree. To me, it's the most interesting thing about George Washington. And it seems a real shame that to so many people, he is this piece of perfection.
Yeah. Cardboard figure.
What Hawthorne said, born with his clothes on, and entrance in the world, made a stately bow, his hair was powdered, and it feels to me like people know, and I give tours in Philadelphia, I talk to a lot of people. It seems to me that people know Jefferson better, and even Adams better, and certainly now Hamilton, or at least their perception of Hamilton better, and that Washington's a real vague figure to most people. And you know, I suppose a lot of it has to do with those early writers, the John Marshall books, the Weems books, um, that,
Yeah, Lives of the Saints. They sanctified him and set him up on this pedestal. I mean, people do the same thing, I think, to Jefferson.
Mhm.
He is certainly admirable, but he certainly has had his flaws as well. And the notion that all of us, whether we're in the history books or not, are just bumbling through this life doing the best we can, is at the core of my uh, regard for history. And I love to see people who screw up terribly and then fix it not only externally but internally, fix themselves.
Yeah.
Washington floundered around a good great deal. He was a second son. That's the other thing about history that seems to me it needs to be kept more in mind, is that if we just dabble in it, the result is a comic book without any dimension. For example, primogeniture is not something anybody knows anything about today, but it was critical to the lives of people then. Washington was forever crippled because he was a second son, and all inheritance went to the first son at that time. Do you know that he never owned Mount Vernon? He held a life tenancy because his brother, the first son, left it to him in a will, a life tenancy. But it was not to go to his children. It was to go to his brother's children. His brother never asked for that to happen after Washington died, so it stayed in Washington's line, but never legally. He never owned Mount Vernon. Now, to me, that's amazing, and you gotta realize once you know that must have weighed heavily on him. He was obsessed with accumulating land and houses, uh, and making money with it. He was obsessed with getting a commission in the British Army, which was the only position you could hold in that time that guaranteed you a pension. And he did everything but jump through hoops to try to get that commission. And I often think if the idiot British generals had just given him one, they would probably still rule America.
It's you know, what you say is very is what it jumped out on me, what you just told me about him not ever really owning Mount Vernon, because I only know it because I read your book, and I've read dozens of books on George Washington, and maybe somebody mentioned it, but that really throws a different light, because it's not how we look at property
Right.
today, especially
Right.
if you live in the North. You know, who cares after you die? And it's everything. Back then, it's almost like when you realize that Franklin Roosevelt was still getting a allowance from his mother when he was president of the United States. That puts it all in a context that, you know,
Real history is really interesting. We're being sold, these days, with reference to the Civil War and other things, a cardboard version of history that lacks dimension, lacks any comprehension and sympathy for what they went through.
Mhm.
And, we're tearing down Civil War statues left and right and leaving up the statues of the Union officers who pivoted from the noble Civil War and freeing the slaves to committing genocide in the West. The same individuals. We're leaving their statues up. Why? Because we don't really understand our own history and we don't read it. We just tell each other cute little stories about it.
Well, of course, I live in Philadelphia, and do you know which general is in front of City Hall? The statue is McClellan, is in front of City Hall.
Lincoln's famous telegraph: "If you're not using the army, could I borrow it for a few days?"
Yeah. What on earth could the horses be tired from doing? And the guy that questionably was doing his best, not to carry out the wishes for sure of the president, and had different ambitions, and but Yeah, it's kind of funny that nobody notices that it's McClellan. I think I lived here
Yeah.
10 years before I realized that's McClellan. But well, and what you say is interesting too in regards to your book, because you spent a lot of time on the context. Now, I've read lots of books about George Washington and that period of time, but you spend a lot of time talking about what's going on out west in terms of the different indigenous populations out there, and the French and
Yeah,
the
the
fire
amazing case.
treaties, and it's a whole
That's a
story on its
place.
own.
That's a place where even our serious histories fail us terribly. The American Indians were invisible to Washington and his fellows, and they remain invisible to us. Nobody that I know of, well, now I can't say nobody because obviously I had sources to find the information, but very few people care about or know anything about what existed when the colonists came ashore and began eating up the land. The fact that all of the cultures that they encountered were matrilineal. And when I was writing that book, I had to keep a little chart. A matrilineal society in which everything proceeds through the line of the mother. The father, here's one of the great ironies. In those cultures, a person's father was virtually a stranger. You were born into the clan of your mother. You went to live with your mother's people. Your father had nothing to do with your upbringing or education. Your uncles did. And so when you read a true transcript of a meeting involving the Native Americans and they're addressing people with respect, they use the term uncles. Hear us, uncles. And here are the Englishmen saying, your great white father in England. They never stopped saying it, ever. And they never, ever understood that it was a completely meaningless concept to the people they were talking to. They couldn't imagine that there would be any more powerful image than great white father. And the Native Americans simply didn't know what they were talking about. And you wonder, how can stupidity be that impermeable, you know? How could they not have noticed? But we haven't noticed yet, for the most part. And we've had a couple hundred years to work on it. And we still don't know that about them. We don't know what the deal was. The British were constantly frustrated because they couldn't get direct answers to their propositions, whether it be, we want to buy this land. Well, they take it into council. The Native Americans required unanimous consent. If they didn't get it, they just kept meeting as long as it took. Drove the British officers mad, crazy. There was one wonderful story where, in order to put an end to this, they selected an elder of one of the tribes, I forget which one right now, and declared him to be king and held a coronation. And gave him a red coat. The thing is that the guy they selected had something else to do that day, so he had his cousin stand in for him, and they didn't know that. But at last they had their king. But of course, it didn't change a thing, because that's not how the Native Americans made decisions. The other thing was that the Native Americans put the highest value on what was said. They remembered. They were very good. They remembered their histories verbally, with, you know, some assistance from whatever. But when there was negotiation going on, it was what was said in council that was important to them. And if they got agreement there, they were satisfied. Well, then the council would be over and the British would bring in this piece of paper and say, sign here. And quite often that piece of paper wasn't exactly what was agreed to in council, but the English took away their piece of paper and said, we got it. The natives went away with their memory of the council, said, we got it. And a lot of people died thereafter because of the misunderstanding. Things like that I don't find in most of the histories that I come across, and I find it fascinating. And it's part of the complications of history that make it interesting.
One of the stories in your book that I've told a lot of people is how Washington and the others kind of looked down on the Native Americans because they have a system where the women can block the war. And
he was given an opportunity. He was given an opportunity on, I think, on the trip to French Creek to meet with the mother of all mothers, the clan mother of all, the most powerful figure in the Iroquois Confederacy of 6 nations. And he was just totally contemptuous. Why would I go meet with a woman?
Yeah.
What, are you kidding me? And he just kept walking. But they never got any better at it. They never learned. I mean, it was as bad when the Indian Wars got out to the Pacific coast as it was when they came ashore on the East Coast.
Well, you've got to be a particular kind of person. I did a podcast about the Mayflower, which I didn't know that much about, and it's an amazing story. But you have to be a kind of special person to show up somewhere and go, oh, God loves us. He's slaughtered everybody that lived here.
Yes, right.
And I say, wow, we think millennials are bad. I mean,
yeah.
This is self-centeredness to the nth degree.
Yeah.
But that's kind of how it started.
The sense of entitlement, in the sense that people who weren't organized in their society exactly as you were beneath you and deserving only contempt. It was a special attitude which persists.
Now, let me get to the beginning of George Washington as a young man, and one of my favorite, one of the things I love about your book is you say a couple things right off from the beginning, and then you proceed to show them in the book. And one, again, which I really don't think I've heard other people talk about other than you, was here's this guy whose every desire when he's a boy and even as a young man is to become an Englishman and is to become an Eastern aristocrat. And here's a man who's going to become a Westerner, and he's of course going to become an American. And a lot of talk about what this idea of the West is, and being a Westerner and how it affects him, which again is pretty unusual, but I think really key to understanding George Washington. But talk to me a little bit about George Washington as he's growing up with his father, and then the changes that are going to occur to him because his father dies.
Well, his father died when he was quite young. It was his brother that he spent his childhood with, Lawrence. And they were not among the first families of Virginia, FFVs. They were second rank as a family, and then George, of course, was the second son. So his prospects were never very bright, and he was keenly aware of that from a very young age. They certainly did all right. I mean, Lawrence had Mount Vernon, and it was a good and solid estate, but you can see the wistfulness of the young George as he sees the Fairfaxes, for example, and he gets one of his first crushes is on Sally Fairfax. That Fairfax, they're living on the Fairfax grant. Fairfax owns Virginia and West Virginia, I mean, and that certainly was the first family of Virginia, and you could see the envy in George, envy of their security and of the respect that they get from everybody and their station. That's part of human history, I guess, forever. But he definitely was on the downside of that. He definitely was an outsider and resented it. And it's kind of funny now because the first families of Virginia are now organized around Mount Vernon. And there is no greater, no firster family than George is now in Virginia, now that he's long dead and gone. He would, I'm sure he enjoyed the respect he got late in his life, but he certainly didn't get it early in his life. And he didn't, you mentioned the thing between East and West. We're familiar, and we toss around simple notions about the divide in this country between North and South. But I argue in the book that just as significant for just as long has been the division between East and West. Tohigs, the Cohees, and the whatever was the words that they used contemporaneously to describe the planters' society along the coast. And then the people who had moved inland, farming changed. The crops you could grow changed. The size of the land you could maintain changed, and the people changed. And pretty soon, they were a different society. And I can remember in Virginia politics having people being called Mountain Valley boys and Eastern aristocrats. The divide is still there. And the Westerners, and this became true later on when the Westerners were west of the Mississippi River, were a meritocracy. They styled themselves as a meritocracy. It didn't matter who you were born. It didn't matter how much money you had. It mattered how capable you were. And if you were capable and worked hard, you could make something of yourself. And that paired with the fact that this was becoming a land then. And it didn't truly become that kind of a land until after the Revolution, but it was already becoming a land where ordinary people could own their own land. There was nowhere else in the world where that was true. And by the way, I think that's what Abraham Lincoln meant when he called the United States the last best hope of earth, because it was at the time he spoke the only place on earth where ordinary people could own land. Everybody else was holding it by permission and by the pleasure of the king. And they were paying rent on it, and they might have a lifetime tenancy, but that could change if the king changed or if the king's opinion of you changed. You never knew. But in America, and this was becoming true in Washington's time, that you could actually claim land in your own right and not hold it because you were a noble person or because you sucked up to the king, you know. And this was a profound change in human events. And it was taken far more seriously by the Westerners, who spread out and wrested ground from the forest and, built log cabins and fought Indians and whatnot. They became far more wedded to their land than the planters, who were largely criminals and no-goods when they came here, but they immediately reestablished the most rigorous of societal ranks for themselves. They took upon themselves all the airs and privileges of the aristocracy that they had hated when they were living in England. But they tried to replicate the old manorial ways, and the Westerners increasingly were having none of that. Thomas Jefferson was a total Westerner. Washington was, as you say, he was caught between these two worlds. He was functioning in the West, but he wanted so much to be part of the East.
And another thing you bring out that has to do with that is you talk about how Washington is one of these first people to use land as a commodity. Mm-hmm. And like you look at a movie like Red River, and John Wayne finds this land and he says, "This is my land," and someone shows up and says, "No, this other guy owns it. Where does he live? He lives too far away. Doesn't mm-hmm. count. It's my land now." Mm-hmm. Washington's that guy. He's the guy who's going to own land that he doesn't live on. And before he's president, of course, he has to go out to the West and tell all these people living in the West, "I own this land." And they're all very contemptuous, and some of them haven't heard there's been a revolution. But he's going to be one of the early people to look at land not as a thing to own and live on, but as a commodity to become rich.
He had commercial development very much on his mind at a very early age. Despite the fact that all he wanted was an English commission, he pushed the British officers to the limits of patience to try to get them to march west on a route that he had land on. I mean, he really risked his entire livelihood to persuade them to take Braddocks Road a little bit to the south. They were going to go out to the conquering of Fort Duquesne along from Philadelphia, and he just threw a fit. And senior British officers are writing letters to the effect of, "What is the matter with this guy?" What was the matter with him is he understood very well that a British army moving through that kind of country has to improve the road in order to move. And that improved road will then become the commercial thoroughfare for that whole region forever and ever. He knew that. And he had land along a route that he wanted them to take. It was calculating, it was cunning, and he even put his own ambition to be a British officer at risk in order to get this to happen.
Yeah, something that came into my mind, which I almost don't even want to bring up, but I'm going to. But as I'm reading your book this time, again and again and again, I go, wow, this is like Trump.
It's like what?
This is like Trump. and especially that road, because not only is he so adamant for purely personal reasons, really, to have this road go through Virginia instead of Pennsylvania. He views everything, and then I started, he views everything as well, it's a better road. When it's clearly not. I mean, everybody agrees it's not a better road, everyone. And he's, no, we're going to lose the whole war if we don't use our road. Right. And then when that clicked, I kept running into things that were making me think. So it's almost just like, well, he was like, I get people who tell me Trump is like Washington, and now I'm thinking, well, he was, but then Washington grew up, right? Because then his letters and how everything's him. Everything.
Yes.
Young man.
That's the other thing at that period of time. Everything, it doesn't matter. There was one point I think it was after the disaster of the Jumonville ambush, the very next day, he had just committed one of the, arguably, murder of an ambassador. And the next day, he's writing this long letter about how he, damn it, deserves a commission in the British Army. And he somewhat narrowly escaped prosecution for that. So, but he, at that time of his life, his welfare was the number one thing on his mind, no question.
Right. So anyway, just a thought: if you were to look back at it again, some of these things would probably jump out at you as well. Then it occurred to me to remember when he was an older man, and a historian. Warren, her name's Warren, I forget her full name, who knew Abigail Adams, she's doing a history of the period. And she talks to George Washington and says, oh my gosh, we've all been celebrating your victory at Yorktown, but now I've read all your letters in which you never wanted to fight in Yorktown. You wanted to go to New York, and the French had to drag you to it. And Washington, without missing a beat, says, oh, those letters were all to throw off the spies.
Yeah, there's nothing new.
But so going back, well, before we even get to this thing that turns into a massacre, how on earth does George Washington, this young man, he's what, 21 or 22 at that time, get this position of writing out to the Pittsburgh area to have this negotiation with the French that everyone had to know could possibly turn into a world war?
Well, I don't think they went out to negotiate. They went to find out what the French were doing, and it was a small force. It was like under 40 people that they had detected coming this direction where I am, coming east from Fort Duquesne. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to know what they were doing. It was really just a scouting party. He should not have engaged them. And he was young and raw, and it was a task of no particular significance that could be foreseen. It only became significant when he screwed it up. Mm-hmm. And he ambushed these folks without contacting them, without finding out what the situation was, and killed a man who arguably was an ambassador of the French government, coming with communications to communicate with the British government. And so he was embarrassed by that the rest of his life. He didn't like to hear about that particular chapter. And then it was soon obscured by Fort Necessity, which was even worse. Which, at the time, the worst defeat of British arms on the continent, which is not something you want on your record when you're a 20-something major.
Yeah, Fort Necessity, one of my favorite places to visit, kind of a monument to the idea that you can really, really screw up badly as a young
and still become
person.
president of the United States.
Exactly, because you can just stand there to this day. And, you know, it's funny when I talk to people about it, it just seems so obvious to everybody. Why would you put a fort down and below with hills surrounding you?
Well, there's another thing about that battle is one of my favorite little factoids about it, because I'm proud of the fact that I alone seem to have noticed it. Years later, one of the colonels that was with Washington at Fort Necessity wrote a letter to the editor of a Pennsylvania paper, Philadelphia, I suppose, I don't remember, and said, you know, in that entire battle, our force had only 2 worms in its possession. Now, one of the things that I've done, partially because I've always been interested in this period, is I've hunted with black powder muzzle loading weapons. So I know that anybody who goes more than 20 steps without a worm in his possession is an idiot. A worm is a little screw that you fit on the end of your ramrod so that you can extract a bullet from your weapon when it's misfired. It's the only way you can clear your weapon to use it again. And no soldier or no hunter should ever be without one for a minute. And according to one of the colonels present, there were only 2 in the possession of the entire detachment at Fort Necessity. And that speaks to titanic mismanagement. And one of those things that adds texture and interest to history that gets missed and dropped in the comic book versions.
Well, I like also how you described him showing this fort that he's written to Virginia. I have a fort that I feel very comfortable, and he shows this to Tanakarais and the Half King, and he immediately says, "We're leaving." And if I were you, I would do the same.
Yeah.
And the irony is, of course, the French are this close from just turning around and going away before they attack Washington, because they feel like they're away from their sources, and
they were having a terrible time. They had to come all the way down the river from Canada. They had a long supply line. They're out in the wilderness. They have no means of being reinforced. Their supplies are very tenuous. It's an example of a war that didn't have to be fought, like so many others. You know, sort of when the strange dog comes around, just ignore him and he'll go home. But no, we have to look for casus belli.
Mm-hmm. And then you have the document that Washington signs, which people are very upset about.
Yeah.
And again, as I'm reading it this time, I'm thinking of Trump with just almost everything. Again, it's not my fault. It's the translator's fault. Nothing in this book was George Washington's fault, by the way.
Right.
Which, is so different from what he became. I mean, that really is the.
And in some ways, that's true. For example, I mean, his reputation took a terrible hit because of Braddocks' defeat, but he had no responsibilities whatsoever in that battle. He was a messenger boy. He had no military responsibility, and so he shouldn't have been blamed for anything about that battle. But that really was the worst setback for British arms. I love Braddock's dying words. Who would have thought it?
Yeah.
Couldn't.
Yeah. The description of that battle is one of the most fascinating things. And I have to study battles. I give tours of battles, but it's not really my easiest thing. Like, there's some people who are battle people, right? And they just, And me, it's always a struggle, but that was easy. I mean, that was amazing. That's one of the most amazing mess ups, that battle.
Braddock,
Braddock doesn't send them out early, and
he
Braddock.
doesn't have, I had a lot of trouble figuring this out, and I was very careful about reviewing everything I could get my hands on, but he appears not to have scouts or flankers out.
Right.
And that was at the time standard procedure, because you don't want to get surprised by a bunch of Indians in the woods. That was like the whole point. But he appeared not to have had flankers out, and if so, that was just a mind-blowing mistake, and he paid for it with his life.
And what's one of these things that you never get the answer to, right? Because you make clear, well, he did it the day before. He in kind of a similar situation, and he sends the high ground, and he sends the people to the high ground. So some things we never get to figure out.
Right.
One of them, right? I mean, there's just no explanation to why the day before he does it, but on this day, he just says, let's just march forward. And then, of course, this incredible scene you have with the British being just continuously ordered to stand in rows, while the Virginians and the French and the Native Americans, and what again you make really clear in your book is that they had a smaller force, right? I mean, it was really a mismanaged operation, and if they had just come back the next day, they might have turned it all around.
Yeah.
Instead, they just absolutely not only flee, they end up fleeing the country. Basically, they go to Philadelphia, and then
you put your finger on another place where you have to get into the time, and you have to be aware of the imperatives of the time. The British soldier was trained to maneuver into a position where he and all of his fellow soldiers could deliver firepower on an enemy who was presumed to be lined up on the other side of the field. That was the rule. You lined up and you shot at each other until somebody gave way. You didn't go behind a tree. In fact, there was a debate at that time that said, if I'm a soldier and I'm just shooting in volleys in the general direction of the enemy, if I kill somebody, it's not murder. Right. But if I aim my rifle at an individual in the enemy force and kill him, that would be murder, and my soul would be forfeit. That was a genuine argument at the time. So here you have these folks under orders and according to their training to stand in a rank and prepare to fire, and they're being cut down by people peeking out from behind trees. And their training and their beliefs slow them down in their ability to respond to that new situation. And this was true in the Revolutionary War as well. The British were hampered by their traditions and training in the way they delivered firepower on the battlefield. You know, an interesting sideline just occurs to me. Not many years ago, I was teaching a class of 20-somethings at the university about writing news. And I, at the time, there was a bunch of stuff about how people had been caught on the battlefield in Iraq, when in fact they'd been dragged out of apartment buildings and huts, and and the entire country was the battlefield. So I wanted to make that point, and I did it this way. I asked them, I said, I want you to envision a battlefield, and then tell me what it looks like. Do you know that every single kid in that class described a grassy field with lines of troops at either end of it? Their concept of battlefield was civil war. I couldn't believe it. And apparently when they heard the radio tell them that some jihadists had been captured on the battlefield, apparently they were running across the grass at the time. But our concepts don't travel well. If we don't understand matrilineal society, if we don't understand a society that has to meet and come to a total agreement on something, then we don't understand what's going on. and the English didn't, and we still don't. Another little note about Washington that I just love, when he got his first job, this is back before these battles, and he was made adjutant general of half of Virginia, the southern half. One of his duties was readiness of the civilian population. And one of his enormous frustrations, and this always makes me smile, is that he would go visit the cabins and the farms and whatnot and say, well, and everybody by law had to have a functioning rifle and a certain amount of ammunition. Where's your rifle? Oh, I don't know. And they go looking for it, and they'd find this rusted piece of iron in a shed somewhere. Well, where's your ammunition? Oh, I don't have it. And the settlers, and this is in central Virginia, starting to be the Blue Ridge. Their attitude was, the Indians are gone. There's no reason for us to have guns anymore. Guns are for when there's a threat. It's a story I would love to tell some of my Second Amendment brethren, but I don't dare. It was his biggest frustration, is persuading people that they ought to have and keep a gun.
Right. Well, what's also great about the battle you describe is how it breaks down in such ways that you've got the officers shooting at the men, their own men, for running away, the men shooting at the officers, and then mistakenly shooting your old men because you got people over on the side going up. I mean, it is the most crazy battle that I've ever read about, and it must have been just and of course the great question, who shoots Braddock at the end? His men or the other men?
The Last of the Mohicans is a movie that gets all of this stuff right, and if you haven't seen it, I would take a look at it. The other thing they get right is another thing that was a great frustration to Washington, is when he was ordered later on to raise troops and go out west and do things, people would not leave their homes. They said, "To hell with you! I'm here. I have a family here. I built this cabin. I'm not going to go with you into the wild and shoot Frenchmen when I could lose my family." And they wouldn't go. This is very well portrayed in Last of the Mohicans. This was a terrible tension, and the British said, "Excuse me, you're a subject of the British crown, and the king orders you to go." And the settler would say the local equivalent of "Excuse me," "I am not going anywhere." And this was a monumental frustration for Washington as he tried to serve his masters in the French and Indian War. He could not get it. He got so frustrated, and he said some things about the people. You could as well raise them from the dead as persuade them to serve their country. He was very frustrated by that. And it's another thing we don't associate with Washington. We just think of him standing in the boat with the flag, follow me.
Yeah, and another thing you bring out, which again, kind of as I'm bringing it up, reminds me of today, is that so many people refused to participate because there was already these political difficulties with Dinwiddie, and they'd already been having this fight about their rights with Dinwiddie, that when then he says, "Oh, now we need to raise an army," they're all like, "The hell with you. We don't even believe it." And you quote a Washington letter where he says, "They don't believe me. They think this is all just another trick," which in part, you say it kind of is not a trick, but Dinwiddie thinks this is a way to get beyond that and bring everyone together.
Again, it's very difficult to put yourself in that time and that density of population and that lack of communications. But I must say that I have the lingering suspicion that there was a lot less to the French and Indian War than met the eye. I mean, you had these people playing chess with the world, but I mean, these French forces that came down the river were pretty small and pretty beat up by the time they got to Fort Duquesne. It was hardly a mass invasion. I think the largest number of troops at any one point they had was something like 1,500. That is not a continental invasion, but Dinwiddie and others were playing a strategic game to get as big a hold as they could on the continent, and that was fine. But their willingness to sacrifice their subjects to get that done kind of stopped at their subjects' door, because particularly the Westerners, as we've discussed, were cultivating a much different attitude toward the crown. And that attitude was usually expressed with words that you can't say on TV.
Then, so you have that battle, you have Braddock die, and then your book kind of shifts into this whole period, which is just almost tough to read, because not a lot's happening other than Washington being anguished, continuing, and just seems like he has too much time on his hands, and he just digs himself deeper and deeper and deeper until it seems that nobody respects him after his fight over this road and some of the other. And again, to reminding me of people today completely losing his mind over any bad article about him, to the extent that he's going to quit.
Yeah.
People tell him it's a little newspaper article. It's not affecting anyone. It was an article. It's on. And very touchy, right? Very prickly at this period.
And that's when he ran for the House of Delegates in Virginia. I think he lost the first time, if I recall, and then won the second time. And he won the election the way Joe Biden does. He won it by not being there.
Well, Jimmy Carter tried that, and it worked against Ted. It didn't keep working. So that is not forever.
And then he meets Martha, and he starts to settle down, and of course Lawrence is dead by this time, so he begins to come into his own. And at that point, I lost interest in him, because he starts to truly become an interesting man then, and not for his failures anymore. He's starting to put it together at that point. When he marries Martha and settles down and settles into Mount Vernon, he becomes a different person. He's no longer the screwed up kid. But and so that was the close of my book, and what he made of himself later is somebody else's record.
Right, but it is. You look at it as you're reading your book and thinking of, for instance, there's the period with Winchester and all of these Native American attacks, which you write about, and people not being able to really sleep, and the emotional tear that has.
Let me point another. You say all these attacks. I'm not convinced that there were that many Indian outrages. What there were, and I know more than once, I looked into what I thought were several attacks that turned out to be the same attack with slightly different stories told about them.
Okay.
And it made me think of terrorism. How big is the threat actually, and in reality, how many terrorist attacks kill how many people? The effect of an attack is amplified manyfold by the telling and retelling of the story. It only took a couple, and I'm not saying there weren't any. I'm saying that the impression we have of this endless bloodshed on the frontier really didn't happen. There were a scattering of attacks, and each of those attacks scared the bejesus out of everybody that lived out in those woods, for reasons that you will appreciate if you ever go out and stand alone in these woods and look around. I get scared of Indian attack, and you can't. These people are out of touch. They don't have any communications. They don't have any help available to them. No wonder they got scared. But
and you describe very specifically, there's the one with the 12-year-old boy and his father's there, and they poke him with sticks and light him on fire and kill him. You don't need that to happen a lot of times. Right. Once is enough to scare the living hell out of the whole community, right? If you're looking out on your own. But it did occur to me that what Washington ends up doing before crossing the Delaware, the way he just keeps doing these little guerrilla attacks crossing the river, coming back, crossing the river, coming back. Seems like he learned that that kind of warfare could be effective, because that was pretty unusual kind of thing to do back then. So, so he learned, I guess, is the end of your story, which is the part
he did absorb the lining up in two lines. Yeah, my internet connection is unstable, it says.
Yeah.
Are we still in communication?
Yeah, you're just bouncing a little bit. But
it's good enough for network TV. It's good enough for us.
It's exactly how I feel. I've seen such worse things and people whose eyeballs on there, so that is better. So anyway, all right. Thank you so much for talking to me. Again, your book, for King and Country, I'm really glad I had the opportunity, because I've read several things on there, but the things we talked about, I really haven't read in a lot of other things, and I really appreciate how you made such context to this story.
Thank you very much.
Really diving into it. That, and like I say, I've been, I'm sure, quoting your stuff for years. With the people I talk to, things like this, the matriarchal system, and I mean, it's just full of really interesting things that help you to understand this for the first time. And to me, I did see that there were people who really complained and said this was a hit piece on Washington.
Not many, oddly enough. I thought. And I showed you this speech that I gave. I had the honor to speak to the Ladies Association of Mount Vernon at their annual meeting, and they sold a lot of books at Mount Vernon. And I didn't get as much of that as I thought I was going to. I thought, man, maybe I ought to have security. But there were not many people who misconstrued, because if anybody who thought I was tearing them down didn't understand what I was writing. But and there were a few, but not many. I remember at the end of that speech, and I showed it to you, where I made the assumption that they used negative politics in Washington's election, and I did his opponent's speech for him, and going negative and casting everything he had done up to that point in the sharpest negative terms. And I thought maybe I would be ridden out of Mount Vernon on a log that night, but they took it well. Not only that, but a distinguished gentleman came up to me and just smacked me on the back, and he said, "Damn, I enjoyed that." And it was the Librarian of Congress. So I figured, well, if I got it past him, I'll probably be all right. But I did not hear what I thought I would hear, the complaints of attacking the saint.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, I don't know, did you see the documentary on Washington that the History Channel did recently? It's about a couple months ago.
Don't know if I did or not. I saw a piece on the crossing of the Delaware where Jeff Daniels played Washington.
Yeah, this was something very recent, but what was interesting, and it was kind of disturbing, because it was part docudrama, part documentary. So you'd have people talking, and then you'd have this scene of something that may or may not have happened. But what amazed me, and I can't remember who talked, and now I can't find it again, but about 3 scholars were talking about that period where Washington goes out to argue his case in Philadelphia, and and waits around for 10 days. You may recall he's still arguing about the road, and he's still arguing about trying to gain the king's, become part of the British Army. And everyone described that as he was like heroically trying to get the British on board and more energetic. And it was this great action of him trying to wake the British up, which everyone knows isn't true. So, he gets a lot of, things flipping in order to look at it on the best light. But to me, your book is a great instruction on it's never too late to kind of, to fix things, because it's a total description of farcical failure after farcical failure in a lot of ways. But he learns from it.
Yeah.
And that's the key.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you. That's an hour of our lives we'll never get back.
Absolutely. Well, you know, I've had a lot. I'll have worse hours immediately after.
Let me know about your final product so I can see it.
I absolutely will. Thank you so much. I appreciate
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, so I stopped recording it. So, well, thank you so much. Oop, I lost you.